The ocean wind hit Frank Miller's face the second he stepped out of his Chevy Silverado, blowing sharp and cold off the Atlantic. Newport was always colder than Boston this time of year, even on a wedding day. The mansion in front of him sat on the cliffs like an old king, marble white, wrapped in rose gardens and secrets. Frank stared at it from the driveway, keys dangling in his hand, knuckles red from gripping the steering wheel. He'd never been to a place like this before. Not for any reason, and certainly not as the father of the bride. Other cars lined the circular drive. Sleek black sedans, an Audi with a vanity plate, a Rolls-Royce that looked like it hadn't driven in rain in 20 years. Frank's truck looked out of place among the machines, every dent in its door telling a different story. He smoothed the front of his old Navy suit, double-checking the tie Abby had picked out for him back when she was still talking to him every week. The suit wasn't new. It was faded at the collar and shiny at the elbows, but it was the best he owned. He'd worn it to his wife's funeral, and again for Abby's Harvard graduation. Today, he'd added something extra. A silver watch on his wrist, battered and scratched, a relic from the year he'd spent in Vietnam. The only thing he'd kept that still ticked after all these years. He grabbed the box holding Abby's wedding present and stepped toward the front steps. With every step, he rehearsed what he would say when he saw her. Maybe a simple, "I'm proud of you, kid." Maybe nothing at all. He'd barely spoken to her in the last year, ever since she'd gotten engaged to Chase Bennett. There were always meetings, calls, new priorities. Frank told himself it was normal. Kids grew up, but he'd watched his daughter drift away from him, further each month, until he felt like a relic himself, a reminder of a life she didn't want to remember. At the entrance, two doormen in sharp black suits stood at attention. One glanced at Frank, eyes flicking over the jacket, the tie, the box. Frank nodded, tried to smile, but the man's mouth twitched and he turned away. Inside, the foyer glowed with gold light, a wall of mirrors catching the sun. Voices echoed from deep in the mansion. Laughter, the clink of glasses, a woman's high heels tapping across marble floors. Frank could see his own face reflected in the glass, grayer and more tired than he'd realized. He never made it more than 3 steps inside. Suddenly, Chase was there, handsome, tall, hair cut in that expensive way rich young men have, the kind of man who never worked a day with grease on his hands. Chase blocked his way, grinning wide, but it was the kind of smile Frank had learned to distrust decades ago. The smile that says you're about to be played for a fool. "Sir, I think you're lost," Chase said, voice low enough that the guests wouldn't hear. Frank blinked, almost laughing at the absurdity, but Chase's eyes were sharp, cold. "This part of the house is for family and close friends only. The kitchen staff uses the side door." Frank felt a chill climb his spine. He glanced past Chase, looking for Abby, but she wasn't there. Only more strangers in tuxedos, not a single face he recognized. Frank cleared his throat, tried to keep his voice steady. "I'm here for my daughter's wedding. Abby Miller." He held up the box as proof, the wedding gift wrapped in white paper, a blue ribbon tied by his own hands that morning. Chase's grin didn't falter. "Of course, Abby's very busy right now. There are photos, final arrangements. It's a complicated day." He leaned in, his words sliding out like oil. "If you'd like, we can have someone bring your gift to the bridal suite. But I'm afraid guests who aren't on the list can't be admitted to the main reception until later. Security's very strict, you understand." Frank's jaw tightened. He hadn't driven 2 hours for this. He tried to step around Chase, but suddenly a large man in a suit, earpiece flashing, appeared beside him. Frank tensed, his hands instinctively curling into fists. He wasn't a fighter, not anymore, but something inside him bristled at being handled, at being made small in front of all these strangers. Chase's mother appeared behind them, all pearls and perfume, a practiced smile on her lips. "Is there a problem, Chase?" she asked, voice so sweet it could rot your teeth. Chase kept his eyes on Frank. "No problem, Mom. Just a bit of confusion with the guest list. We'll sort it out." Frank glanced down at the watch on his wrist, the second hand sweeping its endless circle. He remembered every second he'd spent waiting for Abby to come home from school, every late-night phone call when she was in college and needed money for books, every time she'd looked at him with that mix of gratitude and embarrassment when her friends came over and saw their old, cluttered living room. He swallowed the hurt, the humiliation. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. The security guard's grip was firm on his elbow now, guiding him back toward the doors. "Sorry, sir. If you'd like to wait outside, we can have someone let you know when you're needed." The words weren't angry, just final. Frank looked back over his shoulder as he was let out, but Abby was nowhere to be seen. He stepped outside into the blinding sunlight, heart thudding in his chest, humiliation burning hot behind his eyes. He set the gift box down on the stone wall by the steps, careful not to crush the ribbon. He wanted to sit, to catch his breath, but the line of luxury cars and the cold stares from arriving guests made him feel even smaller. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. There was nothing left to say. That was when he heard the voice, old, trembling, but full of shock and recognition. "Frank Miller? Is that really you?" Frank turned, blinking into the sun. Standing by the curb, leaning heavily on a cane, was Douglas Bennett, Chase's father, looking pale and unsteady as if he'd seen a ghost. For a moment, neither man spoke. The decades between them fell away, replaced by the memory of a muddy hill in Vietnam, the smell of smoke and cordite, the desperate scramble to pull a wounded man out of a burning APC. Douglas took a shaky step forward. "Frank, I can't believe it. After all these years." The doormen looked at each other, unsure what to do. Guests arriving behind them slowed, sensing something unusual, the mood shifting from celebration to uneasy curiosity. Frank's mouth went dry. He hadn't seen Douglas since the war. He'd never told anyone about what happened back then. Not even Abby. The medals, the nightmares, the survivor's guilt. He'd buried all of it, convinced no one wanted to hear about old men and their ghosts. Now, suddenly, the past was standing in front of him, demanding to be reckoned with. Douglas's voice was louder now, carrying across the driveway. "This man, this is Frank Miller. He saved my life in Kisan. If it weren't for him, none of this would be here. You wouldn't be here." He gestured at Chase, at the mansion, at the very world they all lived in. There was a ripple through the crowd. Someone pulled out a phone. Others began whispering. Chase's face went white. Gloria stammered something, her mask of composure slipping. Frank just stood there, unable to move, his hands shaking not from fear but from the tidal wave of memory and regret. He could feel eyes on him, some admiring, some suspicious, all confused. Frank didn't want to be a spectacle. He wanted to see his daughter walk down the aisle. He wanted to hand her the gift, to tell her that love was the only thing that mattered, no matter how much money you had or how many names you dropped on a guest list. But in that moment, he realized something was changing. The story wasn't just about Abby's wedding anymore. The secrets, the betrayals, the invisible line between who belonged and who didn't. Everything was about to unravel. Douglas gripped Frank's shoulder, and for a moment, Frank remembered what it felt like to be needed, to be honored, to be more than just a forgotten face at the edge of a crowd. He knew, without understanding how, that nothing would be the same after today. The world had shifted, and the line between old wounds and new beginnings was thinner than ever. There was something electric in the air, a feeling that everyone was about to witness the collision of two worlds. One built on old money, the other on sweat and sacrifice. As Frank stood there, caught between shame and vindication, he sensed that the truth was finally clawing its way to the surface, and nobody, not even Abby, was ready for what would come next. Frank didn't move at first. It was as if the years had pulled him under, leaving him stranded in some cold stretch of memory, unsure if he was standing on the steps of a mansion in Rhode Island or back in the dust and heat of another life entirely. For one long moment, Douglas Bennett's hand on his shoulder felt heavier than it should have, almost as if it was holding him upright, pinning him between past and present. People whispered, phones tilted in their hands, half-captured images blurring in the late afternoon light, but Frank didn't care. All he could think about was Abby as a little girl, her hand gripping his calloused fingers, her eyes bright as they watched the 4th of July parade roll down their old street in Lowell. Back then, everything he owned fit into a tiny apartment over Sal's grocery, and every dream he had was tied up in that little girl's laughter. He remembered working late nights, crawling under subway trains, hands so numb from the cold that he'd sometimes drop a wrench and have to feel for it in the dark. He remembered the shudder of the Green Line as it thundered overhead, the way the whole city seemed to vibrate with possibility even as he felt himself growing older, one bad knee at a time. When his wife, Helen, got sick, Frank tried to shield Abby from the worst of it. He hid the bills, the letters from the hospital, the pain in his voice. She was barely 12 when the cancer won. The day of the funeral, Abby wore her mother's scarf, too big for her neck, and clung to Frank's arm as if he was the only thing keeping her from floating away. After that, it was just the two of them, two people against the world, learning to fill the silence with burnt toast and after-school TV, peanut butter sandwiches and laughter that sometimes felt like it came from far away. Frank learned to do Helen's chores, laundry, grocery shopping, even the little things like sewing on buttons and braiding Abby's hair for her first school dance. The apartment was always a bit too small and the money never stretched far enough. But Frank did what he could. Sometimes, on Saturday mornings, he'd wake up early and drive out to Revere Beach, just so Abby could see the ocean and forget for a while that their lives were built on such thin, fragile ice. She'd run down the sand, collecting shells and shouting at the waves, and Frank would sit on a bench, watching, feeling both proud and terrified at how quickly she was growing up. He remembered the night Abby got her Harvard acceptance letter. She came running into the living room, waving the envelope, eyes shining with disbelief and hope. Frank hugged her tight, his own hands shaking with pride and fear. He knew what Harvard meant. It meant loans and long hours, a future brighter than anything he could ever give her. But it also meant she was going somewhere he couldn't follow, into a world he'd never understand. Still, he did what he always did. He drove her to Cambridge on move-in day, helped carry her boxes up the stairs, made her bed in that tiny dorm room, then kissed her goodbye and tried not to cry until he was back in the truck, staring at the Charles River, wondering how time had slipped away so fast. From then on, their lives ran on parallel tracks. Abby's filled with classes, new friends, study sessions and phone calls home that got shorter every semester. Frank still called her every Sunday. Sometimes she answered, sometimes he got voicemail. When he missed her, he'd bake the banana bread she loved, even if it always turned out heavy and dense, and freeze a loaf for when she came home. Frank's work at the MBTA was steady but unglamorous. He fixed brake lines and changed light bulbs, mentored young guys who never listened the first time, and told stories about the old days when trains ran late and you could hear the Sox game on every radio. Sometimes the guys would ask about Vietnam, about the medals tucked away in a box in his closet, and Frank would shrug, telling them it was a long time ago. He never told Abby the real stories, the ones about crawling through mud and smoke, the fear that lived under his skin long after he came home. The only thing he kept close was the watch, scratched, battered, still ticking. It had belonged to his squad leader, lost in an ambush outside Da Nang, found again when Frank pulled Douglas Bennett out of a burning Jeep and carried him to safety. That day had cost Frank a piece of his hearing, a chunk of his peace of mind, but he never regretted it, not once. He wore the watch like a private badge of honor, a link to the man he used to be, a promise that even ordinary men could do extraordinary things. As the years rolled by, Abby grew into her own person. She spent summers interning at law firms, then in New York, chasing big dreams Frank barely understood. Every time she came home, there was a little more distance between them. Inside jokes that faded, silences that grew longer. Abby tried to keep him included, inviting him to galas and dinners, but Frank always felt out of place. He wore the wrong clothes, said the wrong things. He could never quite shake the feeling that he was being measured and found wanting. Still, he tried. He sent her birthday cards, called every holiday, mailed her clippings from the Boston Globe when he thought she might be interested. He never stopped being proud, but the pride started to taste bittersweet, mixed with the ache of missing the girl who used to sit on his lap and watch cartoons on rainy afternoons. When Abby met Chase, Frank was hopeful at first. Chase seemed polished and friendly, always quick with a joke or a compliment. He shook Frank's hand, looked him in the eye, even called him sir. But Frank saw the calculation in Chase's smile, the way he scanned rooms, made connections, always angling for advantage. Chase came from money, the kind that moves through generations without ever touching dirt or sweat. Gloria, Chase's mother, was even more intimidating. A woman who ran charities for show, measured her worth in gala invitations, spoke about people as if they were items to be acquired or discarded. Frank watched as Abby was swept up in that world, slowly learning to speak its language, to smile when she wanted to scream, to bend herself into someone who fit at those glittering tables. She started calling less, her visits became rare, and when she did come home, she seemed tired, wary, as if she was auditioning for a part in her own life. Frank tried to reach out, tried to remind Abby of who she was, who they were. He invited her back to Lowell for a block party, but she was busy. He mailed her the old photos from her childhood, but she never mentioned them. He even offered to pay for part of the wedding, though he knew he couldn't match what the Bennetts would provide. Abby thanked him, told him not to worry, that everything was taken care of. It hurt, but Frank swallowed it, told himself that letting go was part of being a parent. Still, on nights when the house felt too empty and the clock ticked too loud, Frank wondered if he'd failed her. If all those years of doing the best he could had somehow left her longing for a life he'd never been able to give. Now, standing in front of Douglas Bennett in the shadow of that mansion, Frank felt the weight of it all. He saw Douglas's face change as the memories crashed over him. The recognition, the guilt, the awe. Douglas's hand was trembling. "Frank, I never got to thank you," he whispered, his eyes wet. Frank tried to smile, tried to make light, but the moment was too raw, too heavy with the ghosts of another life. The crowd pressed closer, their curiosity growing, their whispers sharpening. Gloria's mask of composure cracked. She tried to smile, but the effort looked painful. Chase glared, his world slipping out from under him, the control he'd always taken for granted suddenly useless. Frank felt his old instincts kicking in, the urge to retreat, to slip away before things got ugly. But something held him in place, something stubborn and proud. He realized, with a start, that he didn't want to disappear. Not this time. He wanted Abby to know who he was, to understand the cost of the world she was marrying into. He wanted her to remember that love wasn't about money or status, that it was about sacrifice and loyalty and the quiet courage of ordinary men. The silence stretched. Douglas squeezed Frank's shoulder, then stepped forward, clearing his throat. He looked at the assembled guests, at his son, his wife, and for a moment, the mask of the billionaire slipped away. He was just a man, humbled by the debt he owed to another. Frank stood still, feeling the eyes of the crowd, the weight of expectation. Somewhere inside, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, today would be different. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the courtyard, scattering rose petals across the steps. Frank caught the scent of salt and seaweed, the familiar tang of a life lived close to the edge. He looked up and saw Abby, framed in the doorway at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide, her mouth open in shock. For a split second, their eyes met, and Frank saw the little girl she used to be. The one who believed her father could fix anything, who trusted him to keep her safe. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him now. A stranger? A relic? Or maybe, finally, the man she'd forgotten she needed. As the guests began to murmur, Douglas turned to his son. "Chase, this is the man who saved my life," he said, his voice low but clear. "Without him, you wouldn't be standing here." The words landed like stones, sending ripples through the crowd. Frank watched Chase's face contort with disbelief, pride, and fear. Gloria looked away, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. In that instant, Frank understood the truth. Everything was about to change. The past was no longer something to be hidden, a burden to be borne in silence. It was a weapon, sharp and bright, ready to cut through the lies and pretensions of this glittering world. The secret he'd carried for decades was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone now, and none of them would ever be able to look at each other the same way again. The last time Frank had felt this alive, he was pulling a wounded man out of a burning vehicle, hearing the crack of bullets overhead, tasting the copper tang of fear and adrenaline on his tongue. Today, the battlefield was different, but the stakes felt just as high. He knew that the fight ahead would be longer, more complicated. It would mean confronting not just Chase and Gloria, but Abby herself. The distance between them, the choices she'd made, the pain that had grown up between father and daughter like weeds in a garden left untended. As the wind settled and the crowd began to shift, Frank straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and met Abby's gaze without flinching. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years he was ready for it. The weight of the past was still heavy, but it was no longer just a burden. It was a source of strength, a reminder that he had survived worse than this, that he still had something left to fight for. The hush that fell over the courtyard didn't sound like silence at all, not to Frank. He heard 100 details at once: the ocean wind worrying the rose bushes, the shuffle of expensive shoes, the sound of a champagne glass tipping over somewhere on the patio. He heard his own pulse in his ears, a deep, relentless thudding. There was a sense that the very air had changed, that the ground beneath them wasn't quite steady anymore. He kept his eyes on Abby, who still stood just inside the doorway, her face pale and uncertain, clutching the side of her dress like a child afraid to let go. Douglas Bennett was the one to break the spell. He turned away from Frank, facing the crowd as if he'd suddenly remembered himself. But he didn't carry himself like the master of the house. Not anymore. There was something stripped away in his posture, something raw. He cleared his throat, the words fighting their way past old scars and unfinished apologies. His gaze swept over the faces gathered on the steps. The politicians, the bankers, the lifelong friends, the strangers who would tell this story in their own voices by the time the sun set. Frank wanted to look away, to disappear, but it was too late for that. Douglas began to speak, his voice stronger than Frank expected, every word carrying weight. He told them about Kisan, about the morning that split his life into before and after. He didn't spare himself, didn't try to paint his younger self as a hero. He said he'd been a scared kid, a lieutenant out of his depth, pinned down in the mud with the world on fire around him. He told them how Frank had crawled back through the killing field, risking everything to drag Douglas from the burning jeep. He described the smell of gasoline, the crackle of rounds in the air, the sound of Frank's voice, calm and steady, saying they were almost safe. Frank stared at his feet, fighting the urge to run, to shout him down, to make the story stop before it swallowed the whole day. But Douglas kept going, his voice threading through the crowd like a lifeline. He talked about the years after, how he'd built his business, raised a family, thrown lavish parties in places like this. He said every good thing he'd had since that day was owed to Frank Miller. There were people in the crowd who remembered Douglas as a young man, back before the money, before Newport, before the family name meant anything. They listened, some with tears on their faces, others with skepticism or even jealousy. But no one interrupted. Douglas's story settled over the gathering like a cold front, forcing everyone to reckon with a truth they couldn't buy their way out of. Frank felt exposed, stripped down to the bone. He wondered if Abby was proud or ashamed, if she understood that courage wasn't always loud or showy, that sometimes it was a quiet refusal to let someone else die alone. For so many years, he'd carried that mourning with him, letting it shape the way he loved his daughter, the way he showed up for the people who needed him, the way he forgave himself for the things he couldn't fix. Now, in front of all these strangers, it didn't feel like a badge of honor. It felt like a secret being stolen, repurposed for a world that prized spectacle over substance. The reaction was a strange mix. Some applause, some stunned silence, a low ripple of disbelief. Chase tried to recover, to reassert control. He stepped forward, his voice dripping with practiced confidence, talking about family values, about how every wedding was a chance for unity and forgiveness. But his words sounded hollow, artificial. The mask he'd worn all his life had slipped, and he couldn't quite get it back on. He tried to minimize what happened at the door, suggesting that there had been a simple misunderstanding, that security had only been doing their job, that everything was in order. But someone, Frank would never know who, had caught the earlier confrontation on video. Within minutes, phones were buzzing, guests turning their screens to each other. On the small, glowing rectangles, Chase's face was clearly visible. His words, unmistakable as he told Frank to leave, suggested he belonged with the kitchen staff. The damage was instant and irreversible. The narrative had changed. Chase was no longer the charming son-in-law, the catch of Newport society. He was the boy who tried to throw a hero out on his own daughter's wedding day. Gloria's poise collapsed in on itself. Her hands shook as she tried to explain, to smooth things over, but the guests had turned. Whispers grew louder, questions sharper, the mood swinging from celebration to something far uglier. Douglas's expression hardened. He spoke quietly to Gloria, to Chase, but Frank could see the anger, the disappointment. Douglas was a man used to controlling outcomes, steering fortunes and reputations with a word. Now, in the face of this very public humiliation, even he seemed at a loss. Through all of it, Frank's world had narrowed to Abby. He watched her come down the steps, moving as if through water, her eyes locked on him. She stopped just out of arm's reach, her breath shaky, her voice barely a whisper. He saw the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, the fight inside her not to break down in front of everyone. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The hurt between them was a living thing, sharp and insistent, but so was the love. Frank could see it in the way Abby held herself, the way she tried to steady her voice as she apologized. She told him she hadn't known, that she never would have let it happen if she'd seen it, that she was sorry for how far apart they drifted. Frank wanted to believe her, to wrap his arms around her and promise that nothing could ever really break them, but the words stuck in his throat. The crowd was still watching. There was no privacy left, no way to pull her back into the world they'd shared before all this began. Chase tried to intervene again, reaching for Abby's hand, but she pulled away. There was a moment of naked vulnerability, the kind that only comes when all the old illusions have been stripped away. Abby looked from her father to her fiancé and seemed, for the first time, to really see what had been done in her name. The calculations, the cruelty, the silent assumptions that her past wasn't good enough for her new life. She shook her head, stepped closer to Frank, and in that moment, Frank saw the little girl she used to be, defiant, loyal, brave. It was enough to make him hope, for the first time in months, that things might still be repaired. The guests, sensing a shift, began to break into smaller conversations, the buzz of gossip spreading like wildfire. Some were sympathetic, others quietly judgmental. There were people recording, people texting, people sharing the story before it was even finished playing out. Frank stood his ground, refusing to flinch, to shrink away. He had been shamed enough for one lifetime, and he would not let his daughter carry that weight for him. Douglas, after a private conference with Gloria and Chase, turned back to the crowd. He spoke with a gravity that silenced everyone. He said that Frank Miller was an honored guest, that anyone who disrespected him would answer to the Bennett family, that the wedding would proceed only with Frank's blessing. It was a public act of restitution, but Frank heard the deeper message. The old world, the one built on secrets and status and silent complicity, was dying in front of their eyes. In the chaos that followed, Abby's friends gathered around her, offering comfort and support, but she only had eyes for Frank. She told him she wanted to talk, really talk, away from the crowd. He nodded, feeling the tension drain out of him, replaced by something new. A sense that this moment was bigger than both of them, a turning point neither could have predicted. As they slipped away to a quiet corner of the garden, Frank took her hand in his, marveling at how small and strong it still felt. Abby cried, letting the tears fall in great, silent waves. She asked if he could ever forgive her, if they could find their way back. Frank listened, holding her as he used to when she was small, telling her that love didn't vanish just because it had been neglected. He told her that he was proud of her, that nothing could ever change that the only thing that mattered now was what they chose to do next. For the first time since arriving, Frank felt something like peace. Back in the house, chaos reigned. Chase and Gloria scrambled to control the narrative, calling in favors, pleading with Douglas, but the damage was done. The story had already taken on a life of its own, spreading beyond the walls of the mansion, rippling through Newport and out into the wider world. Frank's humiliation had become a public reckoning, a mirror held up to all the unspoken rules and ugly truths that underpinned their world. Frank watched Abby, saw the lines of worry and regret fade from her face as they sat together in the garden. He told her stories he'd never shared before about Helen, about Vietnam, about the things he'd learned in the years when it was just the two of them. Abby listened, really listened, and Frank felt the old bond between them knitting itself back together, fragile but real. There was still pain, still anger, still a long road ahead, but for the first time, Frank believed they might make it through. As the sun slipped toward the horizon, the wedding became something else. Less a celebration, more a confrontation with the truth. The guests would go home and tell their own versions. The Bennetts would recover or reinvent themselves, and Frank and Abby would have to figure out what it meant to be family in a world that had tried to define them by everything but love. But for now, in the golden hour light, Frank let himself hope that forgiveness was possible, that dignity could be reclaimed, that maybe, just maybe, this story wasn't finished yet. It was as if the world had split in two, the old rules and new, the stage-lit version of the wedding still happening inside the mansion and a raw reality unfolding quietly in the garden. Abby's white dress was grass-stained at the hem, her eyes rimmed red but steady. Frank's hands were rough and awkward, but he kept them close by her side, not quite ready to let go, afraid that if he did, the moment of truth might slip away. For a long time, they simply sat in the late light, not needing words. Each of them seemed to be counting losses in their own way. Years gone, pride wounded, dreams both broken and unexpectedly alive. Inside, Gloria tried to marshal her forces. She and Chase moved among the guests with brittle smiles, whispering to old friends, desperate to rewrite what everyone had just witnessed. She called in favors, dialed the numbers of PR consultants she'd never thought she'd need. She even tried to convince Douglas that the right kind of statement, the right kind of money, could put this all back together. But Douglas stood apart, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the empty stretch of lawn where Frank and Abby had disappeared. For the first time in decades, he didn't want to fix things. He wanted to change them. News of what happened spread through Newport and beyond. Within an hour, the video was everywhere. Local reporters huddled near the gates, and some guests, those who could feel the tide turning, left early, quietly avoiding the Bennetts and their embarrassment. Chase's college friends, the ones who always laughed loudest at his jokes, kept their distance. The weight of humiliation had shifted. No one could ignore what was in plain sight. But Frank didn't care about any of that. Sitting with Abby, he felt something close to relief. They didn't need the approval of these people. He'd spent his whole life working so Abby wouldn't feel less than anyone else. But here, with the trappings of wealth falling away, he realized that the fight had never really been about money. It was about dignity. It was about respect, about being seen as you truly are, about not letting anyone erase the sacrifices you made just because you didn't come wrapped in silk and gold. Abby wanted to go back inside and face the crowd, to make a statement, to defend her father publicly. Frank stopped her, squeezing her hand. He didn't want vengeance, not in the way people expected. The moment called for something quieter, more lasting. They walked together to the far edge of the property, where a simple wooden bench overlooked the water. There, Douglas found them, his footsteps heavy with the weight of 1,000 memories. He apologized, not with empty words but with a look of regret that Frank knew was real. He told Frank that he was done hiding behind family legacies and social contracts, that the Bennetts would make things right, not with another display of power, but with an act of service. Douglas announced, then and there, that he was transferring a large portion of the family's charitable foundation into a fund to be managed by Frank, directed toward scholarships and support for working families, veterans, and people who would never otherwise set foot inside a place like this mansion. Frank tried to refuse, not out of pride but out of disbelief, but Douglas insisted. This was not charity, he said. It was repayment, and it was the first thing that had felt right in a long time. The three of them, Frank, Abby, and Douglas, stood together, no longer separated by class or history, but united by a shared understanding of what really matters. The news of the Foundation's transformation spread just as quickly as the video had. Reporters caught wind of it, and suddenly the story shifted again. What started as a scandal became something else, something unexpected. Local papers called it redemption. Guests who had earlier whispered in judgment now spoke of Frank as a hero, and of the Bennetts as a family brave enough to admit their mistakes and try to fix them. For every person who walked out, two more stepped forward, offering to help, wanting to be part of something bigger than themselves. Chase watched it happen from the edge of the party, his expression closed, calculating. He tried to plead his case with Douglas, to argue for his role in the family's future, but Douglas would not be swayed. He said that leadership was earned, not inherited, and that Chase had shown what kind of man he was when he tried to cast Frank aside. Gloria's outrage turned cold. She withdrew from the fray, calling lawyers and confidants, realizing that her power had always depended on the illusion of respect. Now, with that illusion shattered, she could only stand by and watch as her world slipped from her grasp. Frank, for his part, had no interest in punishing her. He knew that revenge wasn't about destruction, but about restoration, about building something new from the ruins of old mistakes. He accepted the stewardship of the fund on one condition: that Abby would help run it with him. Together, they would make sure that no one else felt invisible, no one else was left outside the door. That evening, as the reception stumbled on in a diminished, more honest form, Frank and Abby returned to the crowd. They were greeted not with polite applause, but with genuine warmth. Guests shook Frank's hand, told him stories of their own fathers and grandfathers, thanked him for his service and for reminding them that decency was not dead. Abby spoke about the Foundation, about the need for bridges between worlds, about how her father had always taught her to look for the best in people, even when it wasn't easy. There were moments of awkwardness, of course. Some people still whispered, others stared, but the tide had turned. For the first time, Frank felt welcome, not as a guest but as himself. He ate a slice of cake, watched Abby laugh with old friends, and felt the burden of years of worry and regret begin to lift. The party took on a different tone. The music was less formal, the laughter more sincere. People danced with abandon, old boundaries dissolving in the face of something new. The staff joined in, the cooks and servers who had watched the drama unfold from the sidelines, now invited to share in the celebration. Frank noticed a young man in a busboy uniform watching him from across the room. Later, the boy approached, shy and unsure, and told Frank that his own father had been a veteran, that he'd grown up hearing stories about sacrifice and honor, and that today had reminded him not to forget those lessons. As the night wore on, Abby pulled Frank onto the dance floor. For a moment, they were simply father and daughter, moving awkwardly but happily in the midst of a world that finally seemed ready to accept them. Frank held her close, the aches in his body forgotten, the years of struggle receding into memory. He realized that the truest kind of revenge was not humiliation or payback, but dignity reclaimed, love restored. Later, as the last guests trickled away, Douglas found Frank again. He said that he was proud to know him, that the day had changed him, that he would spend the rest of his years trying to be worthy of the life Frank had given him back in the war. They spoke of old friends, of battles fought and lost, of futures still unwritten. For Frank, there was a sense of closure, but also a sense of new beginnings. He could not undo the years he had spent on the outside looking in, but he could make sure that, from now on, no one else was shut out. As Frank walked Abby to her car, he felt a quiet satisfaction. She asked if he would come visit her soon, maybe bring some of his banana bread. Frank smiled and promised he would. He watched her drive away, headlights cutting through the darkness, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. He knew he'd made mistakes, but he also knew that redemption was possible, that families could heal, that justice could be more than an abstract idea. Back in the mansion, Chase sat alone, staring at the empty dance floor. He had lost something he couldn't buy back: a father's respect, a fiancé's trust, a sense of certainty about his place in the world. For a while, he would rage and blame others, But in time, maybe, he'd learn the lesson Frank had already paid for 100 times over. As for Gloria, she retreated further into herself, her anger cold and silent, her world shrinking with every passing hour. Frank stood on the porch, breathing in the salty air. The mansion behind him was quieter now, less intimidating. He looked up at the stars, feeling both small and immense, and realized that the story he had feared for so long had become his greatest gift. Not just to Abby, but to everyone who needed to believe that goodness could still win, that honor mattered, that it was never too late to begin again. In the morning, sunlight spilled through the wide windows of the mansion, cutting across the hardwood floors and washing out the evidence of last night's battles. Newport woke with a hush, the sky barely blue, the salt air carrying the sounds of gulls and distant foghorns. Frank sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching the steam curl upward. He hadn't slept much. He didn't feel tired, though more emptied out. Every worry and old resentment stripped down to something simpler. Abby was upstairs, her laughter drifting down in bursts as she talked on the phone with her childhood friend. The sound soft and familiar, a reminder that even in the ruins of disappointment, life could find its way back to hope. Douglas was already dressed, a man transformed overnight. His movements were quieter, more measured, and when he joined Frank at the table, there was no need for small talk. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each thinking about what came next. Outside, the caterers packed up what remained of the wedding, folding chairs clattering, vases boxed, the air perfumed with the ghost of roses. Frank could see the young staff moving quickly, talking to each other in low voices, casting curious glances inside, as if trying to puzzle out who the hero was supposed to be. The foundation's new direction had sparked something no one expected. By noon, emails poured in from local teachers, veterans groups, people Frank had never met, all wanting to volunteer, to share their stories, to give back in a way that felt personal. Some sent photographs, children grinning with new backpacks, old men saluting in faded uniforms, single mothers proud beside their daughters at high school graduations. Frank read every one, feeling the reach of his own story stretching outward, the boundaries of his world expanding in ways he'd never imagined. Abby took charge, working with Douglas and a team of volunteers, building bridges between communities that had always existed side by side but rarely met eye to eye. She organized a meeting at the local community center, inviting everyone who'd ever felt excluded or overlooked, and promised them that this time, the doors would stay open for good. Frank was proud, of course, but more than that, he was humbled. For so long, he'd believed his life was small, defined by loss and hard work, by what he couldn't give his daughter. Now, watching Abby move among the crowd with purpose, watching Douglas stand beside him not as a benefactor but as a friend, Frank realized that dignity was something you built one small act at a time. The news crews that arrived later in the day wanted sound bites and dramatic quotes, but Frank refused to play along. He told them the truth, that most of the real work would never make the headlines, that the people who deserved the most credit were the ones who showed up when no one else was watching. He spoke of Helen, of the neighbors who had raised Abby with casseroles and advice, of the boys at the MBTA who still called him for help fixing a stubborn engine. He spoke of forgiveness and the long, slow process of letting go. Chase was nowhere to be seen for most of the day. He stayed upstairs in his room, blinds drawn, the world outside reduced to the cold blue glow of a laptop screen. Rumors trickled through the house. Some said he was calling old friends in New York, others that he was drafting letters to lawyers, still convinced that his inheritance could be salvaged with the right arguments. But the mansion felt different now. Gloria retreated into her private parlor, making calls no one answered, her authority finally revealed as the fragile thing it always was. In some ways, Frank pitied her. He understood what it meant to wake up and find the world changed, your power gone, your old stories no longer enough to keep you safe. By evening, the community center was crowded. People Frank hadn't seen in decades appeared, some older and slower, some still carrying themselves with the stubborn dignity of working-class New England. There were teachers, former shipyard workers, veterans in their Legion jackets, a few young mothers who had driven in from as far as Providence just to say thank you. Douglas gave a speech, his voice steady, his words full of the humility that comes when a man's mask is finally stripped away. He named Frank as the new director of the foundation, but the real applause came when Abby took the microphone, her words plain and true. She spoke of forgiveness, of the distance between families, of what it means to come home again even when you think you've lost your place. Frank watched her, heart aching in the best way. When the speeches ended, people lined up to shake his hand. Some cried, some laughed, some just stood quietly, grateful for a chance to be part of something honest. It was more than Frank ever expected, more than he believed he deserved. He felt the old wounds healing, the years of silence between him and Abby growing less important by the hour. There was talk of new projects, a program for single parents, scholarships for first-generation college students, a fund for wounded veterans needing home repairs. Frank listened, nodding, promising to help in any way he could, realizing that the only way to honor his own story was to help someone else write theirs. Later, in a quiet moment, Abby found him in the hallway. She told him she was sorry again, not for what she'd done, but for how long it had taken her to see him clearly. She said she'd spent years running from her past, from the part of herself that was shaped by Frank's sacrifices. She thought loving Chase would make everything easier, that marrying into a world of privilege would erase the loneliness she'd carried since Helen died. But standing in the garden with Frank, she realized that her strength had always come from him, from the long nights and hard days, from the unspoken lessons in grace and persistence. Frank held her close, unable to speak for a moment. He remembered the first time he'd taught her to ride a bike, the way she'd fallen again and again, her knees scraped, her pride wounded, but her determination unbroken. He realized that forgiveness was not a single act but a series of choices, made every day, in big and small ways. He told her he was proud, that he loved her, that nothing, no mistake, no distance, could ever change that. They stood together, the sounds of laughter and conversation rising around them. The future opened before them in ways neither could have predicted. Chase, for his part, did not attend the event. Word spread that he'd left Newport, driving north along the coast, his future uncertain. Some said he would reinvent himself, find humility in places far from the spotlight. Others doubted he'd ever change. Frank didn't waste time thinking about him. There were more important things to do. Papers to sign, people to call, a legacy to build that would outlast any one man's pride or shame. As the evening wound down, Frank walked home beneath a sky washed clean by the ocean wind. He passed houses with lights in the windows, heard children laughing inside, saw old friends sitting on their porches, sharing stories. He thought of Helen, of the nights they dreamed together of something more, never realizing that the best part of their life was the struggle itself. He understood now that strength was not about victory or recognition, but about refusing to let the world make you small. At home, Frank found a letter on the porch, a note from a woman he'd helped years ago when her car broke down outside Boston. A simple thank you that ended with the words, "You never know how much one act of kindness can change a life." He smiled, tears in his eyes, and slipped the letter into the pocket of his worn jacket. For the first time, Frank felt at peace. Not because he'd won, but because he'd endured, and in enduring had made room for something better to grow. The old wounds would never fully heal, but they would fade, replaced by new memories, new hopes, new chances to make things right. He was ready, finally, to let the past be the past, and to walk forward into whatever came next. No longer alone, but surrounded by the family and community he'd helped create. Summer in Rhode Island deepened with a fullness Frank hadn't known in years, sunlight lingering over the harbor, days that felt endless in their promise and possibility. The whole town seemed changed, or maybe it was just that he could finally see it. The small gestures between neighbors, the way people paused to chat at the bakery, how laughter rose over back fences, and even the old men at the barbershop seemed lighter somehow. Frank moved through it all quietly, almost wary of how much lighter his heart had grown. The memories that had once weighed him down now seemed part of the air he breathed, softened by forgiveness, by the hard, slow work of letting go. Abby visited often, sometimes just for an hour before work, sometimes for whole weekends, helping him organize files for the foundation or cooking dinner together with the radio low in the background. Their conversations were different now. They spoke honestly not only of the past and the pain but of hope, about what they wanted to build and what they would do differently, about the things they still feared. Abby talked about her mother, about the ache she'd carried, thinking she had to live up to some impossible standard. Frank told her stories he'd never shared, about his own father, about the nights he'd walked the city unable to sleep, how lonely he'd been even when surrounded by people who loved him. The words made something new between them, space for all the pieces of themselves they'd hidden from each other, even as family. Douglas called almost daily, sometimes to discuss a board meeting or a new scholarship, sometimes just to share a joke or recall a memory from Vietnam, letting old griefs settle into laughter. Their friendship surprised them both, rooted in gratitude but flourishing into something neither had thought possible in men their age. There was still the formality of years lived in different worlds, but it melted away in the face of shared purpose. Frank found himself invited to dinners with people who'd never looked at him twice before, people who now asked his opinion as if it was the only thing that mattered. He saw Douglas humbled, changed, sometimes awkward as he learned the language of apology and restitution, but always sincere. They walked together by the water sometimes, silent but comfortable, the years between them bridged by the understanding that neither man would ever have chosen this path, but both were better for it. Chase's absence lingered like a shadow that refused to disappear. Rumors circulated, sightings in New Haven, reports that he was working odd jobs upstate, whispers that he might be seeking help for the first time in his life. Frank didn't spend much time thinking about him, but sometimes, late at night, he wondered what kind of man Chase would become without the shield of his family name. Abby didn't speak of him much, but when she did, her words were soft, tinged with regret but not bitterness. She hoped he would find what he needed, that he'd learn to forgive himself, that maybe someday he'd understand why things had to break before they could be remade. There was no gloating, no satisfaction in his downfall, just a kind of quiet compassion, as if both Abby and Frank understood that life was cruelest to those who never learned how to lose. The foundation grew quickly. Frank met with veterans who had been invisible for decades, single mothers who worked 3 jobs, immigrants building new lives brick by brick. He saw himself in their faces, felt their struggles in his bones. At first, he felt out of place, afraid he would fail them, but he learned to listen more than he spoke, to offer what he could and accept help when he needed it. Abby was tireless, organizing fundraisers, building partnerships, bringing people together who'd never shared a table before. Her confidence was different now, quieter, less desperate to please, rooted in the knowledge that she had something to give that no one could take away. Frank was still recognized around town, sometimes stopped by strangers wanting to shake his hand or thank him for his service. But the attention embarrassed him. He didn't want to be a symbol, he wanted to be useful. When a local news crew asked him what it felt like to have his life turned into a lesson, he only smiled and said that most days he just wanted to fix things. Broken engines, broken hearts, broken trust. That, he said, was enough. The interviewer seemed disappointed by the simplicity of it, but Frank meant every word. There were moments of doubt. The work was hard, the need endless, and sometimes the weight of everyone's expectations pressed down on him. He missed Helen fiercely, especially on the nights the house was too quiet. He missed the certainty of old routines, the comfort of anonymity. But each time the doubts crept in, something would happen. A thank you note from a scholarship student, a meal shared with an old friend, Abby's hand squeezing his as they stood together at the back of a crowded meeting. These moments stitched him back together, made him believe that starting over was not only possible but necessary. One afternoon, Frank returned home to find a letter waiting in the mailbox, postmarked from somewhere in Vermont. It was from Chase. The handwriting was tight and careful, as if he'd written and rewritten it a dozen times before sending. In it, Chase apologized, not just for the wedding, but for all the ways he'd made Abby feel small, for the ways he'd treated Frank as if he was invisible, for the fear that had made him cruel. He wrote that he was working as a mechanic, learning how to use his hands for the first time, that he was trying to build something that was his, not inherited. He didn't ask for forgiveness, only understanding. He ended the letter with a hope that, someday, He could return to Newport not as a prodigal son, but as a man worth knowing. Frank read the letter twice, then handed it to Abby. She cried, not out of sadness, but from relief. A burden lifted, a wound beginning to heal. As summer gave way to early fall, the town's attention drifted to other things. School starting up, the harvest festival, the Red Sox chasing a pennant. Life moved on, as it always did, but the story of what happened at the Bennett wedding became a quiet legend. People still talked about it at backyard barbecues, retelling it as a story of pride and downfall, of a father's stubbornness, of a daughter's redemption. Sometimes Frank heard his own name used as a warning, sometimes as a blessing. He smiled at both, knowing the truth was messier, more complicated than any story that could be told in a single afternoon. Abby asked Frank to give a speech at the annual foundation banquet. The night arrived with a thunderstorm, the air thick with humidity and expectation. The hall was full, hundreds of faces, some familiar, some new, all waiting for him to say something wise, something that would make the past year make sense. Frank stepped to the microphone, his hands steady, his voice rough but clear. He didn't talk about war or sacrifice or even forgiveness, not directly. He talked about banana bread, about learning to bake it badly after Helen died, about burning the first dozen loaves, about how Abby never complained, never asked for something fancier, only smiled and ate every slice as if it was a feast. He said that love was like that, sometimes lumpy and imperfect, sometimes all you had to offer, but always enough if it was given honestly. The room fell silent, not out of sadness but in recognition. People understood. They clapped not because Frank had given them a tidy moral, but because he had spoken a truth they all knew in their bones. The applause lasted a long time. Abby hugged him tight, her face wet with tears, and for the first time since Helen died, Frank didn't feel like anything was missing. After the banquet, as the last tables were cleared and the lights dimmed, Frank sat outside with Douglas, sharing a bottle of cheap wine. They talked about the future, about the risk and reward of second chances. Douglas admitted he still struggled to let go of his old life, but that every day he tried to live up to the debt he owed. Frank laughed, saying they were both just old men trying not to repeat their worst mistakes. In the end, there was no grand triumph, no final confrontation. There was only the slow, hopeful work of living, of mending what could be mended, of letting go of what could not. Frank knew he would never be a perfect father, never a perfect friend. But he was enough. The story would outlive him, and he was content with that. As the moon rose over the harbor, Frank thought of Helen, of all the things she'd given him that could never be measured. He thought of Abby, her laughter echoing across the lawn, the way she looked at him now with nothing left unsaid. He thought of Chase, somewhere on the road, and hoped the boy would find what he was looking for. Most of all, Frank was grateful to have loved, to have lost, to have been given the chance to try again. And for the first time, he understood that justice, real justice, was not about payback or victory. It was about dignity, about the courage to stand tall when the world tries to push you down, about forgiving those who can't forgive themselves, about loving fiercely even when it costs you everything. In the end, that was enough. That was everything.